A mountain accident leaves Richard Collins a millionaire and Sarah Johnson, a resilient botanist, united by an impossible mission to save her nephew Ethan, bitten by a rare snake. Now, with a damaged helicopter and time against them, only courage remains to defy fate. Tell us in the comments which city you are watching from and rate this story from 0 to 10. Your opinion is very valuable. Leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more exciting stories like this. Sarah Johnson was bent over an improvised table, her heavy breathing matching the irregular heartbeat of her nephew Ethan, who was tossing and turning on a small, isolated research station in the Rocky Mountains. The humid air of the forest filled the simple and modest space, where the strong smell of wet earth mingled with the sweat trickling down Sarah's forehead. Each drop seemed to carry the weight of the responsibility she had taken on after the tragedy that left them alone. Suddenly, a loud crash from the direction of the clearing interrupted the tense silence. The sky, already heavy with grey clouds, seemed to hold its breath. Sarah rushed to the door, her heart racing, following the trail of smoke and the strong scent of fuel. In the clearing, a white helicopter marked by grooves and twisted branches lay overturned among broken trees, the rotor paralyzed and spinning in agony. The situation was critical. Richard Collins emerged from the metallic wreckage with difficulty, limping, his face dirty and cut. His gaze was lost, his disheveled clothes contrasting with his usual elegance. He called for help, but the sounds of the forest were the only response. For the first time, his powerful voice sounded fragile and real, far from the comfortable rooms and business meetings of New York. Sarah approached cautiously, keeping her guard up. That figure, though strange, could not escape the necessity. He introduced himself with a twisted humor as one of the richest men in the country, owner of the hotel chain she only knew from magazines. Incredulity found space between the fear of the urgent situation and the shock of the disparity between their lives. Without hesitation, Sarah cut through the strange atmosphere. "It's not safe to stay here. The helicopter could explode," she warned, hurriedly guiding Richard to the safety of the station. The path was steep, the mud slippery, but he followed, supported by the firm hands that held him up. Upon arrival, Ethan appeared weak, clinging to Sarah. Richard, seeing the boy in such a delicate state, abandoned his arrogant demeanor. For the first time, he seemed like an ordinary man in the face of the fragility of human life. That unlikely encounter created a bridge between their worlds, the world of wealth and the solitary struggle for survival. The rain began to fall lightly, and Sarah knew that time was the enemy. Richard watched, confused, at the simple environment surrounding the botanist, his eyes a mix of surprise and admiration for the silent courage of that woman who, despite everything, remained steadfast. "I can help," Richard said, his voice laden with an unusual seriousness. Sarah hesitated, feeling the shock of that unexpected promise, but she knew that at that moment she could not refuse. As the storm deepened outside, the two began an alliance that would change everything, a journey for the preservation of life, for hope, and for discovering the true meaning of strength and commitment. The clock of the mountains seemed to speed up, each second counting down toward an uncertain future. Driven by adversity, this was the beginning of something greater than either of them could imagine. A meeting that would challenge not only fate, but social taboos and inner wounds, paving the way for possible redemption. Life, as fragile as the halted flight of that helicopter, was in their hands, and they knew that, even amidst their differences, only courage could carry forth that impossible mission. Richard stared at Sarah's tired face under the pale light of the station's lamp. Outside, the persistent rain drummed on the zinc roof, filling the air with a strong smell of wet earth and leaves. For the first time in a long time, he felt the real weight of human vulnerability, something he had never experienced in his luxurious hotels and formal meetings. Ethan, the boy with tousled brown hair, lay on the improvised stretcher, his skin warm and body fragile. Sarah leaned over him, adjusting the thin blanket that barely protected him from the cold of the mountains, and looked at him with a mix of desperate affection and determination. The responsibility for his life weighed on her shoulders like a mountain. "We need to act fast." Her voice came out firm, but with a trace of urgency that the silence of the place amplified. Richard took a deep breath. "I will do everything I can to help," he murmured, the unusual seriousness in his voice indicating that he had set aside any pretense to face the situation. Sarah walked over to a counter filled with jars, old books, and some makeshift objects. She picked up a small glass jar containing dried leaves, exuding a slightly sweet and earthy aroma. "This plant helps reduce the effects of the snake's toxin," she explained, lightly brushing her fingers over the leaves. "But the real antidote is at the medical center. It's a few hours' drive." Richard frowned. "The nearest medical center?" "2 hours from here if the road is open," Sarah said, her voice tightening with fear. "With this rain, it will be difficult even for a 4-4. He rubbed his chin, contemplating the gathering clouds and the urgency of every second. "We need to try. We can't wait." Ethan, with effort, tried to sit up on the stretcher, and Sarah helped him, kissing his warm forehead. "Hang in there, kid," she said, her voice choked. Richard looked at the two, feeling the helplessness he had never known. "There's an old SUV at the base. It can handle the terrain. I can try to drive to the medical center." Sarah stared at the man, for the first time without reservations. "It's going to be dangerous," he warned. "The road must be slippery, and any obstacle could delay us further." "I've already been hurt today," Richard replied with a weary half-smile. "I'm not backing down now." They worked in silence, preparing Ethan for the journey. Sarah carefully wrapped the boy's arm, trying to contain the swelling from the bite, while Richard helped carry the stretcher with surprising care for someone so accustomed to luxury and command. When the rain eased slightly, the group set off toward the SUV parked near the woods, each step heavy with the red mud that turned the road into a continuous challenge. The air was thick, mixing the strong scent of the soaked trees with the old engine of the vehicle. Along the way, the silence between Sarah and Richard was laden with unspoken thoughts, tensions barely contained. She observed his frustration in the face of difficulties. He, in turn, seemed to absorb the weight of this reality that was so different from what he knew. "Do you live here alone?" Richard asked with genuine curiosity, breaking the quiet that enveloped them. "Alone? Not really. Ethan and I," she replied, glancing at the boy. "But yes, it's usually just the two of us. Life here is simple, tough, but it's my fight, and now, for his life, even my luck." Those words resonated with Richard more than he expected. All the security and control he had built in the city faded in the face of that raw simplicity, revealing a rare strength. Ethan groaned, waking them both. Sarah soothed him with a gentle touch, while Richard looked out the window, watching the trail disappear among twisted trees, muddy holes and slippery stones. The vehicle's speed decreased, and the tension grew with the uncertainty of the distance still ahead. "Have you faced tough times before?" Sarah asked cautiously. He laughed a bit bitterly. "Life has taught me that money can't buy everything. Difficult forgiveness, family pressures, betrayals. But this is different. This is about what really matters." "Yes," Sarah agreed. "Life itself, not the walls we build." The conversation brought them closer, though neither dared to admit it. The danger and urgency intensified the invisible boundaries of that alliance. When the road finally signaled the end of the dense woods, the white medical center among the trees seemed a mirage of hope, although its aged walls and makeshift operations showed that the battle was far from over. Richard and Sarah carefully descended, carrying Ethan into the corridor filled with voices, sharp with the smell of medications and cleaning supplies. There, the difference between wealth and poverty lost significance in the face of human urgency. While Sarah sought help from the nurses, Richard stayed by the boy's side, holding his hand, feeling a connection that surpassed any other bond he had ever known. In that moment, the mountains, the road, and the rain were left behind. What remained was the pure definition of what they truly were: ordinary people fighting against fate. They didn't know it yet, but here began not only the battle for Ethan's life, but the birth of a story that would break down walls, tear off masks, and reveal the essence of what it means to love, trust, and face together whatever comes, even when everything seems lost. The fluorescent lights of the medical center cast a cold glow that made the air feel even denser, laden with the strong smell of antiseptics and faint hopes. Sarah moved through the narrow corridors, her hurried steps echoing on the already worn linoleum floor, while carefully holding Ethan, feeling his fragile, warm body against her own. The boy was pale, his eyelids half open, struggling against a persistent fever that seemed intent on consuming every drop of his strength. Richard followed closely behind, his attentive and restless gaze absorbing every detail of the environment that contrasted so sharply with his luxurious and controlled surroundings. They were met by a weary-looking doctor whose eyes bore the marks of daily battles in a public unit that barely managed the essentials. He examined Ethan with urgent haste, his nimble fingers touching the warm skin, the delicately swollen arm at the site of the snake bite. "He's stable for now," he announced, his voice filled with contained concern, "but the antidote needs to be administered soon. The venom from the jararaca is treacherous and can cause severe damage if not fought quickly." Richard felt a tightness in his chest, a strange sensation that made him feel small in the pure fusion between life and death. Sarah squeezed the boy's hand tenderly, holding tightly to the fragile flame of hope. "When will the antidote arrive?" Richard asked, his tense voice laden with anxiety. "Tomorrow morning," the doctor replied with a resigned sigh. "Our unit relies on the Red Cross for supply, and unfortunately the stock is empty until then." The silence that followed felt heavier than any word. Richard and Sarah exchanged a look that intertwined fear and determination. "What can we do until then?" he asked. "Keep him hydrated, manage the pain, and trust that his body reacts," the doctor replied. "Patience and vigilance are crucial at these times." In the moments that followed, they fought against the clock. Sarah remained seated next to Ethan, stroking his worn hair, speaking in the softest and sweetest voice she could muster. Each small breath from the boy was a silent victory, an invisible carpet covering the uneven ground of that battle. Richard, who had never imagined himself in such a vulnerable situation, revealed an unusual side. Between trips to the small cabinet for water, medications, or even soothing details to ease the suffering, he surprised himself by caring. With care, as if that attention could serve as a bridge between that difficult moment and a life less cold than his. "I never thought I would find myself in this kind of place," Richard admitted in a shy pause. "In my world, you pay and everything happens. Here it's different. It's too real." Sarah raised her eyes to him, touching the sincerity that hid behind that arrogant facade. "Life has a strange way of pulling us out of our comfort zones," she said. "It forces us to face who we really are, without masks." Behind the words, an intimacy grew that neither of them wanted to acknowledge, but it filled the room and shifted the focus from pain to a connection that challenged their differences. They were trapped in that moment, between Ethan's fragile existence and the silent convulsion of their own hearts. The days were long, marked by fragile advances and feared setbacks. Sarah kept her eyes on the boy, recalling the early moments, the long conversations, the cold nights by the window, watching the stars, and trying to decipher a future that seemed shallow and uncertain. Richard, in turn, wrapped himself more and more in humanity with each simple gesture: a glass of water, a blanket adjusted, whispered words to soothe. During a stuffy dawn, the silence was broken by Sarah, who, between sighs and tears, revealed pieces of her life: the loss of her sister who left her alone with the boy, the daily struggle to support him, the loneliness stuck in her throat. Richard listened, feeling the fortress he had built with such effort begin to crumble. "I thought money would solve everything," he confessed weakly. But here we learn that there are things that even money can't reach. A sad smile formed on Sarah's lips. "Maybe that's why we're here together," she said, her eyes shining with tired hope. "Because what we're experiencing now is bigger than any title or situation." Finally, the arrival of the antidote was like a light in a dark tunnel. The doctors began treatment immediately, their eyes attentive, while Ethan, fragile, began to respond. Sarah let tears slip silently down her face, a mix of relief and contained emotion. Richard held her hand tightly. That simple gesture sealed a bond distant from power and wealth, a bond made of exposed humanity and courage. In the modest medical center, where the walls carried stories of pain and resilience, something rare and precious was born. The promise of a new beginning, the chance to break down internal walls, to piece together the fragments of the soul with hands that had never touched before. They did not yet know, but that fight for Ethan's survival was the beginning of a story that would shape not only lives, but also wounded hearts. A story of love, trust, and learning, where challenges would not be avoided but faced together, even when everything seemed lost. The sunlight began to filter through the gaps in the worn curtain, heralding a new day in the medical center that, for Sarah, already signaled a turning point. Despite the deep exhaustion weighing on her eyes, there was a subtle glimmer of hope and determination, as if an internal storm was finally beginning to subside. Ethan slept in a light and restless slumber, protected by those silent efforts shared between her and Richard. Richard, in turn, remained seated in a hard plastic chair, observing that improbable scene that changed everything around him. The arrogance that had so often defined him was now making way for an unexpected vulnerability, a late recognition of what truly mattered. It was then that the silence was again interrupted by hurried footsteps and a familiar face. Henry, Richard's brother, entered the room with a face burdened by worries and harsh certainties. "Richard," he began, his voice firm and urgent, "you need to hear what I found out. Your involvement here is dangerously out of control." Richard lifted his gaze, the tension in the air cutting through the hope he had tried to shelter. Henry had never been someone who understood nuances. For him, everything was always a matter of business, control, and maintaining a pristine appearance. "Henry, this isn't the time." He tried to silence him, but the tone was in vain. "Then listen," he insisted, his eyes narrowed. "The company is under attack. Investors have started to doubt your leadership after news of your unexplained absence surfaced." Sarah, sitting next to Ethan, felt the atmosphere grow even denser. This was not just a family problem. Reflections of the outside world threatened to invade that sacred space, the makeshift shelter where the most important fight was now taking place. "They are using your disappearance to sow doubt. And honestly, I don't know what you're doing here, wasting time in a public medical center while everything could collapse." Henry's voice cut like a knife. Richard gathered the remaining strength, and the expression of someone finally making a firm decision replaced his hesitation. "This, Henry, is what matters now," he said, pointing to Ethan. "It's not just about my company or my image. This is what I'm willing to fight for." Henry doubted, but did not insist. A silent warning hung in the air, suspending any further argument. Later, when his brother left and the door closed with a dry echo, Sarah looked at Richard with a mix of concern and understanding. "You're torn between two worlds," she said, her voice soft yet firm. "You need to decide what truly matters." He took a deep breath, his hands clasped in his lap. "I always thought the answer lay in stability, in control," he confessed, looking at the floor, "but realizing that everything can crumble makes me question if building walls is the right path." The conversation dragged on into the early morning, between silences and revelations, memories and uncertain plans. They knew that the storm had not passed, but their newly discovered strength united them against any threat. In the following weeks, the routine of the medical center became a stage not only for medical care, but for a silent transformation. Sarah and Richard embarked on a puzzling alliance. She, humble and fierce; he, accustomed to power and luxury, but now learning to step down from his pedestal and dedicate himself. Amid whispers and small gestures, the chemistry grew, and the mutual respect, once overshadowed by prejudices and doubts, began to blossom. However, Richard's world demanded its price. The press began to sniff around the executive's absence. News slipped out of closed circles, and critical voices rose in shareholder meetings, questioning his ability to lead. Amid this growing pressure, one more surprise would shake his foundation. An unexpected visit from someone from the past, with ambiguously friendly intentions, but whose presence would awaken buried traumas and painful doubts. Life, as always, ordered its upheaval with violence and subtlety at the same time. And Richard, for the first time, would learn that fighting for what you love often means letting go of what you fear to lose. In the corridors of that simple medical center, where no fortune guaranteed mercy or privileges, a battle much greater than survival was unfolding, that of the heart that insists on reinventing itself, even when the world insists on bringing it down. And the question that haunted them each day was cruel and illuminating. How far is it worth going to save what truly matters? The following morning brought not only sunlight streaming through the dusty windows of the medical center, but a latent tension that seemed to pulse in the air. Sarah calmly adjusted the blanket over Ethan, now more serene, with his breathing almost rhythmic, while Richard observed from a distance, absorbed. The weight of the world outside reverberated in his thoughts. Every missed call, every news story slipping through social media contributed to a torment he could not simply push away. At the door of the room, determined footsteps appeared, accompanied by an elegant figure, whose presence made Sarah frown, and Richard close his eyes for a moment, as if trying to contain an internal whirlwind. "Oh, Richard!" Gabriel Miller's voice cut through the silence with a mix of softness and determination. "It's been a while since we last met." It was impossible not to feel the heat of discomfort grow between the two men. Gabriel was a shadow from Richard's past. A business acquaintance who had become someone important, but who brought with him a past full of intimate disputes and veiled resentments. Gabriel's aura carried an ambiguous promise. He could be an ally or an enemy, depending on the tone of that meeting. "Gabriel," Richard replied, trying to maintain his composure, "what brings you here?" "I came to see if everything is all right," he said, showing a contained smile that did not reach his eyes. "Things in the boardroom are complicated, and your absence has generated a lot of speculation." Richard felt the weight of Gabriel's gaze upon him, and for a moment the mask of control crumbled. Sarah sensed the almost palpable tension that contact provoked and positioned herself protectively in front of Ethan. "His presence is not appropriate right now," Sarah said, her voice calm but firm. Gabriel averted his gaze, respecting the invisible barrier erected there, though his eyes never stopped analyzing. "I know you have your reasons," he continued, "but I'm here to offer help. Perhaps more than you think." Richard jumped between suspicion and the repressed desire to accept that outstretched hand. Gabriel represented everything he had tried to avoid, the world of ruthless business and power games. But he also knew he needed allies to protect what he had been building, even if in an unlikely way. Later, alone, Richard contemplated the grey landscape outside the ward window. The smell of coffee cooling in the cup on the table beside him seemed the only real detail in a scenario of uncertainties. "Can I trust Gabriel?" he thought, feeling the weight of the dilemma. Meanwhile, Sarah continued to observe the man who now shared her space and who, little by little, seemed to be disarming the fortress she had locked herself in for so many years. Despite the glaring differences, they had found in each other not only an urgent refuge, but also a bridge to the future, grounded in sincerity and mutual care. In the following days, External pressures increased. Phone calls from lawyers, late meetings that Richard could hardly attend, cast ever-growing shadows over the reality once protected by the medical center. Gabriel remained close, offering strategic advice and support, but his presence carried an enigmatic air that kept Sarah on alert. It was on a rainy afternoon that Sarah, after helping to change Ethan's bandage, sat down beside Richard, exhausted and thoughtful. "Richard, I'm scared," she confessed, looking into his eyes. "Scared that when he gets better, this life here will end, and we'll have to go back to the harshness outside. I don't know if I'm ready for that." He held her hands, feeling the warmth that made him breathe easier. "We don't have to go back to anything we don't want," he said, his voice low and firm. "We are creating something here, even if fragile, something I never knew could exist for me." Her smile shone for a moment, illuminating the closed room. The upheaval happened one night when Ethan had a relapse. The boy went into convulsions, and chaos took over. Sarah and Richard worked side by side, desperate until silence returned, heavy and relieved. In that moment, among the sweaty bodies and uncontained tears, Richard realized that the price of transformation was greater than he had imagined. Being vulnerable, loving, caring without guarantees was a challenge that hurt more than any battle in the corridors of high finance. Life demanded them wholly, and in the midst of this, in the midst of the hurricane, the question that burned in their hearts remained: how far were they willing to go to save not only Ethan's life but, more importantly, the possibility of that love, still so uncertain and precious, blossoming from the ashes of what they were and what they could be. The early morning carried the heavy silence of things left unsaid, yet felt in every sigh and the irregular rhythm of the heart. Sarah sat beside Ethan, now breathing more easily after the crisis, her hands intertwined with his as if they could transmit strength that no medicine could ever reach. Richard, exhausted, leaned against the wall, his eyes fixed on the worn floor of the room, where invisible marks of the past seemed to diminish with each passing moment. The contrast between that humble environment and the storm that raged in their hearts was not only in the walls, it reflected in their gazes as they began to learn the true meaning of surrender and shared fear. Sarah broke the silence, her voice trembling slightly, not from weakness, but from carrying the intensity of that suspended moment. "Richard, I can't deny it anymore," she began, diverting her gaze to the curtains that fluttered nervously in the night breeze. "I feel something very strong for you. I don't know if it's fear or hope, but it's real." He slowly rose, and the dim light of the lamp cast soft shadows on his weary face. "I feel it too, Sarah," he replied, his voice hoarse, almost a whisper that filled the space between them. "It's been hard to let go of what I knew, the certainties that protected me for so long. But you've shown me that the fortress I thought was invincible was made of fragile glass." The emotion hanging in the air was a delicate thread of electricity, coursing through their bodies and quickening their breaths, making the atmosphere dense with possibilities. They took slow but determined steps until they found themselves in an embrace where differences dissolved, and skin spoke what words still hesitated to confess. Sarah felt the strong warmth of Richard's hand in hers as he whispered, "I won't promise it will be easy, nor that this world of approvals and interests will disappear, but I want to be here, by your side, to face whatever comes." She smiled, a flash of strength that seemed to challenge not only time, but the years of doubts and losses. "Then we will fight together," she said, with tears already dried on her cheeks. "For Ethan, for us, for something worth it." That early morning, amidst the shadows and the fleeting calm of the medical center, something changed forever. It wasn't just Ethan's life that was at stake, but a new beginning, arduous and true, that challenged the rules of their past and the society around them. The following days brought a mix of small triumphs and unexpected obstacles. Ethan responded to treatment, his renewed strength inspiring everyone around him. But the outside world continued to pull Richard into an unyielding reality. The pressures returned with full force: emergency meetings at the company, covert investigations, along with people who believed that his absence would be a sign of weakness. Gabriel resurfaced, this time with proposals that mixed business and manipulation, making the thin line between support and control painfully clear. Richard felt the weight of the decision: to remain true to what was beginning with Sarah, or to yield to the pressures demanding his surrender to the old life. Sarah, aware of the battles he faced, never set aside her own strength. On a rainy night, while changing a bandage on Ethan, she spoke with determination. "Richard, don't let fear steal what we've built here. I know the world out there can be cruel, but this is where the real is." He looked into her eyes, finding in her the courage that seemed to be lacking in many moments of rest. "You've shown me that I don't need to be perfect to be strong, and that love can indeed be a revolution." Amidst exhausting journeys and moments of tenderness, the couple began to lean on a trust that challenged their deepest insecurities. The nights bore witness to shared secrets. The days were marked by small gestures that carried enormous meanings. A coffee brought at the right moment, a silent smile, a hand gently squeezing another when fear threatened to return. But the struggle would not cease so easily. One afternoon, as the sky threatened rain, Sarah received an unexpected call that shattered the fragile peace they had built until then. It was a voice from the past, known and feared. Threatening words and a veiled proposal that put not only their future, but also Ethan's safety at risk. Richard knew in that instant that the battle ahead would be the hardest. A war that would demand sacrifices, courage, and above all, the ability to trust completely. As the external and internal storms loomed, they knew that their story, bitter, sweet, imperfect, was far from a simple conclusion. And in the tangled web of doubts, fears, and hopes, there remained the only certainty: the love that was born there would have to be stronger than any storm. The rain poured heavily on the rusty roof of the medical center, each drop resonating like an unsettling drum, accompanying the rapid beat of Sarah's heart. She held the phone with trembling fingers, the voice on the other end echoing veiled threats, pointers of a past she swore she had buried forever. "Do you think you can escape, Sarah?" the harsh voice asked, filled with disdain. "Your boy, this life you're trying to build, could end in the blink of an eye. Remember, I know where you are. Do you know what your safety will cost? Your obedience." Sarah swallowed hard, pressing her lips together until the pain was almost physical. The shadow, the blackmail spread like a subtle poison, contaminating every moment of peace that she and Richard had painstakingly built in that cramped room. She hung up the phone with a snap, the sound seeming even louder in the cutting silence. Richard, who had been watching from a distance, approached slowly, sensing the anguish pulsing in her irregular breath. "What happened?" he asked, almost reverently, in the face of the unexpected fragility of the woman who had become his safe harbor. "I was threatened," Sarah murmured, her eyes glistening as she sought strength in his outstretched hand. "It's someone from my past. They want me to go back to doing what I've always tried to forget." Richard enveloped her in a firm embrace, feeling the hardness of her body against his, as if he were absorbing all her pain and fear. "I won't let anyone take you away from me," he whispered, almost like a prayer. It was the beginning of a new battle, an invisible war that mixed the cruelties of the real world with the delicate terrain of the heart, where trust and fear intertwined in a dangerous dance. The following days were marked by an almost palpable tension. Sarah avoided leaving the room, her eyes constantly alert, as if every shadow could hide the impending danger. Richard reinforced the protections he could afford, hiring security and limiting visitors. However, they knew that none of this would erase the threat that loomed, invisible but relentless. It was one night, when the medical center was already falling asleep, that the turning point came. A strange sound, hurried footsteps in the corridors, low voices whispering names in a conspiratorial tone. Richard grabbed Sarah's hand, his body tense, eyes on maximum alert. He knew that this invasion could be just the beginning. "We have to get out of here," he ordered, his firm voice allowing no discussion. With eyes shining with fear and determination, Sarah nodded. Ethan was asleep, tired, but still too vulnerable for any movement. They needed to act quickly, plan carefully. In the days that followed, a kind of clandestine routine settled into their lives. Richard used his contacts to create escape routes, moving confidential information, while Sarah gathered emotional strength she didn't even know she had. Protecting Ethan became the top priority, and at the same time, the glue that kept the trio together despite life's irregularities. From that experience, Sarah and Richard's relationship deepened in an irreversible way. As they faced real dangers, they discovered an intimacy that went beyond the physical, a bond woven in the little things, in the shared smiles after sleepless nights, in the pauses to hold each other's hands tightly in the face of uncertainty. In one of those moments, in a cramped cafe at a simple diner near the medical center, Sarah broke the silence. "You know, I never imagined someone like you could want someone like me," she said with a shy half-smile. Richard took a sip of the bitter coffee and gazed out at the fogged-up window. "I didn't even know I could be afraid of losing something so simple and yet so vital," he replied, his gaze fixed on his hand, resting on the table. But even the bonds built so carefully were not immune to life's twists and turns. A decision made to try to shield Ethan and his future ended up igniting an unexpected crisis. Richard received an irresistible offer, a proposal that could finally close the financial gap threatening the boy's treatment, but which implied an official return to the business world, with all the exposure and risks that would bring. The dilemma gnawed at him from within. Accepting would mean saving Ethan from a practical standpoint, but perhaps sacrificing the newfound peace that was beginning to blossom between him and Sarah. Amid anxious conversations and intertwining plans, they hesitated to get lost in the labyrinth of choices. They knew that each misstep could not only bring down what they had been building, but also affect the future of those they loved. They found themselves at that crossroads where love, fear, and hope mingled in the most delicate of equations. And in that tangle of emotions, one clear certainty emerged. To save what was most precious, they would have to face not only the world, but also their own shadows. The night had darkened some time ago, when the lights of New York began to fade gradually, swallowed by the dense and humid urban fog that winter stubbornly poured down. In the small room of the medical center where Ethan rested, Sarah and Richard sat side by side, their hands intertwined in the brief and silent ritual that had become their support for each other. The child's rhythmic breathing filled the room with a fragile sweetness, almost a sigh of hope amid the turmoil surrounding them. The closed envelope on the table seemed to frighten more than the silence that hung in the room. Inside it held the possibility of a financial restart, salvation for the exorbitant costs that Ethan's treatment required, but also the bitter taste of returning to a world that Richard had tried to leave behind. A universe of cold chambers, empty speeches, and traitors disguised as allies. "I don't even know if I want to go back," Richard confessed, his voice low, almost a whisper so as not to disturb the peace of that unstable night. "That world demanded too much from me. It shattered me into pieces I didn't even know existed." Sarah looked at him, her eyes shining with the flickering light of the lamp, in the dimness where revelations and fears intertwined. "What if this return isn't the cure but the wound again?" she asked, holding his hand firmly. "Ethan needs stability, but I've also seen you rebuild something stronger, something more real." The atmosphere between them was a mixture of tenderness and tension, with the distant sound of rain tapping against the window, accompanying the storm brewing in their hearts. The dilemma solidified in their gazes. Richard knew that if he accepted the offer, they would sacrifice and renounce what was beginning to bloom between them. But if he refused, he risked the continuation of his son's treatment, the life of the boy who had united them. In the days that followed, hours blurred between imminent business meetings and the endless shifts in the children's wing of the medical center, where Sarah cared for Ethan and so many other children who, like him, relied on the faintest hope. The weight of the decision pressed silently, like a growing shadow consuming smiles and casual words. The encounters between Sarah and Richard became brief and laden with subtext, furtive glances, hesitant touches, and the latent desire to say what fear stifled. In one of those brief pauses while they sheltered from the light drizzle under an awning in a nearby square, Sarah broke the silence that had weighed heavily for days. "Richard, I don't know what will become of this life, but I am certain of one thing. I don't want you to lose yourself again," she said, her voice choked as her fingers sought his in a gesture so simple yet full of meaning. He looked at her, and for a moment all the weariness of the soul seemed to dissolve in the depth of that silent embrace. "You saved me from myself," he said, letting out a tired but genuine smile. Despite the moments of tenderness, the world outside continued to close in. The news about Richard's possible return to the financial market spread quickly, bringing with it suspicious glances, malicious whispers, and veiled threats. Security at the medical center was reinforced, but the unease did not dissipate. It was in the early hours of one morning, when Sarah was resting exhausted on the couch, that the phone rang. The voice on the line was grave and sent chills down her spine. "If you want to protect someone, you better think twice, Sarah. We're not just talking business now. Think about what's at stake." The message was cut off before it could provide more details. The clear warning instilled a fear that even sleepless nights could not erase. Richard knew they had crossed a dangerous line that would force them to unite even more, not just as partners, but as guardians of an uncertain future. Amid a landscape that called them to make difficult choices, Sarah and Richard made small and large decisions that would outline the path ahead. They talked at length, defined strategies, shared fears and dreams with a brutal honesty that only urgency could grant. "We're going to make it, Richard," Sarah said during an impromptu meeting on a park bench as the rain continued to fall. "Maybe not the way we dreamed, but the way life allows us." He looked at her with the intensity of someone who had found a strength greater than himself. "I promise that, no matter what happens, I won't turn back," he said, his voice firm, his hands squeezing hers as if to mark that moment forever. Richard's decision was finally made. He would accept the offer, not because he desired the world he had left behind, but because he wanted to secure a future for Ethan and for the love that had begun to blossom. He knew the risks were real, but he felt capable of facing the shadows that had haunted him for so long. Sarah would accompany him, vigilant and hopeful, step by step in this recovery. And so, amidst chaos and possibility, the silent promise that intertwined their destinies took shape. The love was not just a refuge, but the weapon with which they would fight against the storms yet to come. The awakening of that morning carried a heavy air, as if the entire city followed the rhythm of tension pulsing in Richard's chest. The dense fog covered the streets, and the grey light filtered through the curtains of the room where Sarah still rested. The silent fragility of her breaths was the anchor amidst the storm surrounding them. He stared at the ceiling with tired eyes, thinking about the weight of the decision that now defined not only his future, but also Ethan's and Sarah's. With almost reverent care, he brushed a strand of hair from Sarah's face and felt the warmth of her skin under his fingertips. A knot formed in his throat, not only from the fear of everything they were about to face, but from the clear understanding that, despite the darkness that frightened them, together they would be stronger. In the silence of the room, the ticking of the clock seemed to count the seconds to a new reality. The following days were a succession of commitments, meetings, and negotiations, where Richard returned to the business world with a mix of caution and a desperate desire to secure the resources that would save Ethan. Each call answered. Each meeting scheduled was a silent battle, fought with carefully measured speeches and a tense web of suspicious glances. Sarah was always present, sometimes by his side in the meeting room, sometimes in the hallways of the medical center, being the support and the voice that reminded him of why he was fighting. She brought with her a balance he didn't know he needed, the certainty that he was not alone. On a particularly grey afternoon, when the rain swirled like a heavy curtain over the city, Richard emerged from a tense meeting in an old building in downtown New York, his suit jacket soaked, dripping with every step he took on the sidewalk. The cold air filled his lungs, while a sense of urgency and vulnerability enveloped him. Under the awning of the bakery where Sarah was waiting for him, the smell of fresh bread mingled with the warm aroma of coffee, a precious normalcy amidst the chaos. "How did it go?" Sarah asked, observing the fatigue etched in his eyes. "More complicated than I thought," Richard replied, rubbing his wet hands together. "But not impossible. We're close to a deal. I just need you to hold on a little longer." She smiled, trying to hide the fatigue that weighed on her own shoulders, and between sips of coffee and fingers intertwining, they devised a plan of attack against uncertainty. But as the gears of the business turned, old and new shadows moved in the margins of Richard's life. Old rivals, unhappy with his return, began to lurk, stirring up personal and professional situations that Sarah noticed through silent gestures and the increase in secret phone calls. The distance created by the pressure between them was fueled by Richard's resistance to show his vulnerabilities. The burden of pride and fear prevented him from admitting that he needed help. One night, after a brief veiled discussion filled with frustration and concern, Sarah decided to break the silence that separated them. "You don't have to carry this alone," she said, her voice trembling, almost pleading. "I'm here, Richard. I always have been. We don't have to fight this alone." He looked away, his fingers nervously drumming on the edge of the table. "It's not easy to trust. I've tried, and I've broken. Maybe I don't know how to do it differently anymore." With a gentle gesture, Sarah moved closer, firmly holding his hand, conveying without words that she would be there, step by step. "We'll relearn, together." Gradually, the barriers began to give way. However, just when it seemed they were finding their way, the past knocked on Sarah's door again, in the form of a woman with dark eyes and a smile that held secrets of her own. The meeting, in a quiet room of the medical center, was charged with tension and cutting silences. "I thought I had left everything behind," Sarah said, her body rigid. "Some things never truly close," the woman replied, her gaze challenging. Richard heard the words and felt the ground shift beneath his feet, aware that this revelation affected not only Sarah, but the entire plan they were building. Buried secrets threatened to resurface and jeopardize not only their financial future, but the trust they had built so carefully. They both knew that the road ahead was no longer just about conquering the market or securing treatment for Ethan. It was a journey of confronting internal shadows, ghosts of the past, and the external storms that poured their strength upon them. It was there that love needed to prove itself invincible, the only weapon they had left to continue facing the world and themselves. And despite the headwinds, that was the promise they held, step by step, side by side, invincible in their vulnerability. The conversation in the cold room of the medical center hung in the air like a dense fog, laden with words unspoken, but cutting like invisible blades. Sarah remained still, her eyes fixed on the woman before her, whose presence resonated like an echo of the past she thought was buried forever. The silence seemed to threaten to swallow the little courage she had left. "Who are you?" Sarah's voice came out strong, despite the tension trembling in her throat. The woman stepped forward, her gaze intense like smoldering fire. "Someone from your past," she replied with a slight smile. "Someone who brings truths you'd rather forget." Richard, who had been observing in silence until then, felt the world spin a little faster. He moved closer, his hand resting on Sarah's shoulder, conveying silent but firm support. "Sarah, what's happening?" His voice came out low, filled with concern. She took a deep breath, feeling as if an immense weight was falling on her shoulders. "She knows things I tried to hide, things I thought I had left behind when I decided to move on," she replied, her eyes shining between anger and pain. "Truths can either be liberating or not," the woman pondered, crossing her arms, "but they always come with a price." Sarah's gaze closed in sadness as she fought against the urge to flee, to escape the storm that was beginning to form within her. "Why did you come now?" The question came out almost as a plea. "Because the past has a way of coming back when you least expect it, and because you need to know what cards you're playing with," the woman replied, with the coldness of someone who guards secrets like shields. Richard tightened his grip on Sarah's shoulder, protecting her, but knowing he couldn't push all of this away with a gesture. He understood that the fragility of their present depended on choices they would still have to make, together and painfully. That night, after an insistent request from Sarah for Richard to accompany her to a private meeting, they walked together through the streets illuminated by the old streetlights of the city. The distant noise of cars mixed with the whispers of the early morning, while the cold air made their faces flush. "I don't want to hide anything from you," Sarah said, her voice choked, "but I'm scared of what this could do to us." Richard held her hands, the warmth of her skin warming the cold that enveloped him. "We don't have to carry this weight alone. We've been through so much. This won't be different." The touch was both a challenge and an invitation, the promise that no matter how arduous the path, they would face it together. The next day they returned to the medical center to clarify things. Sarah asked to speak with the woman, inviting her to be frank, without roundabout explanations or masks. "I don't want lies to destroy the little I've managed to build," Sarah said, facing those words like a shield and a sword. The woman sighed, with a look that mixed resignation and sadness. "What I have to tell you isn't easy, but you have the right to know everything, even if it hurts." Thus, revelations came to light like pieces that had been hidden for years at the bottom of a chest. They were stories of difficult decisions, losses, sacrifices, from a past that Sarah had tried to forget in order to reinvent herself. She confessed that she carried a secret locked away, a shadow that could threaten the stability they so desperately needed. As the truth unfolded, Richard remained by Sarah's side, gripping her hand tightly, sharing the pain that was not just hers, but theirs. "No matter what comes," he said firmly, "we will overcome. I believe in us." Sarah looked at him, her eyes misty, and felt that despite the hurricane, there was a safe island in that gaze. In the days that followed that conversation, tensions continued to arise, pockets of fear and distrust that needed to be confronted. Their relationship went through unexpected tests, moments when doubt almost won, but where sincerity and commitment spoke louder. Richard faced strategic battles at work, while Sarah sought strength to deal with the past and protect Ethan from the outbursts of this new storm. However, the two remained united, allies not only in love, but in a silent war against the ghosts that insisted on haunting them. On a sunny afternoon, sitting in the garden of the medical center, Sarah confided her greatest vulnerability, drawing in the air the shadow that had always accompanied her. "I never wanted anyone to know this," she said, her voice low. "I was afraid it would be a burden that would destroy me." Richard held her face in his hands, looking deep into her eyes. "You are stronger than you think," he said, with the tenderness he had long tried to show. And I will always be here to remind you of that. There, amidst the distant chirping of birds and the comfortable silence of love, they found what so many others lost in the chaos. The certainty that the true battle was not against the past or the world, but against the fear of facing what hurt the most. The next stage of the journey would be challenging, but they would never be alone. And even when the wind seemed too strong, they knew that together they could withstand any storm. The sun began to bid farewell, tinting the sky orange and pink as Sarah and Richard left the medical center and headed home. The fresh afternoon air colliding with the long shadows created an atmosphere of transition, something between the past they needed to leave behind and the uncertain future that awaited them. Their footsteps echoed on the sidewalk, dampened by the recent rain, a rhythm that gradually marked the tempo of a new beginning. Richard kept his gaze fixed ahead, but his nervous hands brushed against the hem of his jacket as he processed everything they had lived through in the past weeks. Sarah's face reflected the fatigue of silent battles, but her eyes carried an indomitable spark, as if the heavy secrets they bore could not suffocate the hope that insisted on blossoming. Upon arriving at the building, the familiarity of the cramped elevator and the metallic sound of the doors closing created an intimate setting, a sanctuary where they could finally let their defenses down. Richard looked at Sarah, his breath suspended, wanting to express everything he felt but searching for the right words. Time seemed stretched, each second laden with possibilities he feared or longed to embrace. "Sarah," he began, his voice low, wrapped in hesitation, "it's not just Ethan's future that's at stake, it's our future too." She averted her gaze, biting her lower lip, an involuntary gesture of someone trying to contain emotions that threatened to overflow. "I know," she finally replied, her voice choked, "but as impossible as it sometimes seems, I don't want to run away anymore. I want to face all of this with you." The closeness turned into warmth, and they stood there, side by side, feeling the comfortable silence speak more than 1,000 words. The world outside continued its unpredictable course, but in that moment, they both seemed suspended in a space where only the promise of what they could build existed. In the days that followed, routine absorbed them, but with new meaning. Between medical appointments, business meetings, and taking care of Ethan, Sarah and Richard learned to dance on the tightrope of uncertainty, supporting each other in their falls and celebrating all the small victories that together composed their resilience. A rainy morning surprised them in the kitchen of the small and modest apartment where they were temporarily living. The fogged window created a distracting scene. Drops marched in rhythmic cadence as the strong smell of fresh coffee filled the air. Sarah absent-mindedly stirred a mug, her eyes lost in thoughts that seemed heavier than the laden sky. "Richard," she called, her voice hesitant. He entered quietly, trying to read her mood. "What's wrong?" he asked, gently placing his hand on her shoulder, as if to convey security. She slowly turned, her eyes meeting his with a glimmer somewhere between vulnerability and courage. "I have been thinking about what that woman told me, about what I left behind. I never told you everything, and I think now, maybe it's time." Richard furrowed his brow but encouraged her with a calm sigh. "You can talk. I'm here." The revelation Sarah shared was a snippet of an old wound. A story she had kept silent about for years, a secret that, if released, could either free her or devastate her. Amid her words, the aura of guilt and fear diluted, giving way to the hope that the shared weight could become lighter. Richard followed her accounts with attention and empathy, some surprised tears glistening in his eyes as understanding grew between them. There were no judgments, only the recognition that true love flourishes in the storm, sustained by truth even when it cuts deep. The following weeks brought their own challenges. The tension at Richard's work increased with the pressure from impatient investors, while Sarah balanced medical appointments and the constant checkups for Ethan, whose health was still fragile. The nights turned into whispered conversations in the dark, carefully crafted plans to ensure safety and stability. On one of those nights, Richard surprised Sarah by arriving with a tired but sincere smile, holding a simple package. "I thought you deserved something to remember that, no matter what happens, I believe in us," he said, handing her an old book, its yellowed pages bearing witness to other times, other stories of overcoming and love. She opened the gift and found a handwritten dedication on the first page. Simple words, but filled with promise. "Thank you," she murmured, squeezing his hand tightly. In that moment, the outside world with all its threats seemed to fade away, and the apartment transformed into a refuge where love, with its subtle strength, healed invisible wounds. They knew they would still face storms, that tomorrow would not always bring easy victories, but that warm and silent certainty of not being alone was the true foundation of the fight they had chosen to wage. As the sky dissolved, the rain and night dawned at the edges of the windows. Sarah and Richard allowed themselves to dream, even if hesitantly, of days when fear would give way to peace. A future where the family they were forming could finally live in tranquility, nourished by the courage of love and truth. Thus, at this crossroads of pain and hope, they moved forward, each step strengthened by an invisible pact. Together, they could withstand any storm. The dawn filtered its first rays through the window of the modest apartment where Sarah and Richard had been building. With effort and courage, a home made of small victories. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the distant sound of honking horns and the chirping of birds waking up in Brooklyn. In the kitchen, Sarah stirred the pot absent-mindedly, contemplating the aroma of coffee that filled the space with a promise of normalcy, a precious luxury amid the storm that still loomed over their lives. Richard entered slowly, his eyes still bleary from sleep and the heavy thoughts that could no longer be avoided. The pressure of the past weeks weighed on his face, carrying the fatigue of someone fighting hand to hand with invisible enemies. Tense meetings, investors making it clear that time was running out to turn the tide, and the constant anxiety of securing Ethan's treatment, whose fragile smile still lit up the darkest days. "Hey," he greeted, pulling Sarah into a tight embrace. The feeling of her body against his was a silent relief, a reminder that despite the harsh reality, there was shelter here. She responded to the hug with strength, her fingers wrinkled from the heat of the pot still held. "We need to talk," she said, slowly pulling away as their eyes met, filled with a mix of determination and fear. "About the board's proposal," Richard sighed, knowing exactly what she was referring to. He had received an email the previous afternoon with the harsh, almost relentless conditions the company imposed to continue the investment, demanding quick and difficult decisions. "The deadline is tight," he murmured. "If we don't close by the end of the month, they will withdraw financial support, and you know what that means for Ethan's treatment." Sarah nodded, feeling her throat tighten. The ominous clock quickened the pace of the battle they were both fighting. "We have to act," she said, her eyes shining with urgency, "but we won't let them define our destiny." In the hours that followed, words gave way to actions. Sitting at the makeshift table, they revisited numbers, strategies, alliances that could strengthen Richard's position. The tension was palpable, the sound of their voices mixing with the street noise as they sketched plans with the firmness of those who refused to admit defeat. That same day, he would need to face a tough meeting with the investors, where every argument would be a minefield. Sarah remained by his side, not as a spectator, but as a secret weapon. Her presence gave strength and courage, reminding him of the reason for this fight. Arriving at the imposing building on Paulista Avenue, Richard felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. The characteristic smell of the flowers from the suspended garden permeated the crystal lobby, but it couldn't dissipate the anxiety that consumed him. Each measured smile and handshake concealed power struggles that would echo for months. In the meeting room, voices rose in heated debates, veiled threats and disguised promises. Richard maintained a firm posture, his eyes fixed on the statistics and arguments he knew were his last card to save what they could still preserve. Outside, Sarah waited, her fingers intertwined in a knot of anxiety, mentally sending prayers and thoughts she carried in her heart. For Richard, for Ethan, for everyone who needed that silent miracle that seemed to slip away with each moment. Hours later, when the meeting finally ended, Richard emerged exhausted, but there was something different in his expression. A spark of hope. In the car, on the phone with Sarah, his voice carried that confirmation. "We got more time," he said, a tired but genuine smile lighting up his words. "There's still a fight, but we are not alone." She sighed, a mix of relief and gratitude flooding her chest. "I knew we could do it," she asserted firmly. "Now let's make every second count." That night, the apartment that once housed only exhaustion gained a special glow. Ethan's smile, as he received a chocolate truffle made by Sarah, brought warmth that no financial victory could buy. Richard and Sarah exchanged glances, exhausted yet united, immersed in the love that sustained them. But even amid small moments of peace, the shadow of the past continued to linger. News from the business circle and old figures occasionally resurfaced, reminding them that the road ahead remained treacherous. However, this time, Sarah and Richard, they were more prepared. The experience of the past few months had shaped them with a strength that transcended doubts and fears. They had learned that it was not enough to survive. It was necessary to fight with an open heart, with truth as their shield and hope as their sword. On a sunny Sunday morning, Richard surprised Sarah with a simple outing. A walk through the vibrant graffiti of Brooklyn, where art and life blended into a mosaic of colors and stories. There, far from the meeting rooms and cold corridors of the medical center, they found a space to breathe and dream. With their hands intertwined and laughter spilling out spontaneously, Richard spoke softly, like a shared secret. "One day, I promise to take you to a house that is just ours. No masks, no fear." Sarah smiled, her heart light for the first time in a long while. "I will wait for that day," she replied, "but until it arrives, let's live each struggle, each victory, together." And so, reinforced by the silent promise they defended with all their might, they walked into the future, certain that even amidst the most violent storms, the strength of love and unity could transform everything. The sweet aroma of fresh coffee still lingered in the air of the apartment when Sarah woke to the distant sound of sirens and hurried footsteps echoing on the street below. The open window let in the damp breeze of the New York morning, bringing with it a mix of hope and restlessness that seemed to reflect the complexity of the moment they were living. Richard was sitting in the chair of the small living room, his face illuminated by the bluish light of the computer screen, his eyes restless and tired from hours immersed in spreadsheets and reports. Upon hearing Sarah's gentle voice, he stood up, letting out a brief smile that barely contained the tension that worried him. "It's hard to sleep with all this happening," he commented, brushing back the rebellious strands of hair from his forehead. "I know. But together, we are stronger," she replied, slowly approaching until their bodies touched on that grey morning. They had crossed stages that seemed impossible, faced the ghosts of the past, and now confronted the decisive battle. The company's board was relentless, demanding concrete and rapid results. It was like walking on a tightrope stretched between the future and the abyss, where any misstep could mean losing everything. In recent days, signs had begun to arrive, small gestures and veiled threats from that group of powerful investors who would not hesitate to exploit any vulnerability to achieve their ends. Sarah felt the tension grow like a tight knot in her chest, but she could not allow fear to dictate the rhythm of her decisions. Meanwhile, Ethan, with his resilient innocence and bright smile, transformed the house into a setting where love and hope wove invisible threads capable of supporting the family against the headwinds. That morning, Sarah received an anonymous message, an implicit warning that danger was not far away. That information, which threatened to destabilize their strategies, made every call, every meeting, feel like a battle in itself. Richard arrived shortly after, with firm steps and a focused expression. His gaze met hers, filled with an almost tangible determination. "We have to leave here tonight," he said, in a tone that allowed no discussion. "The risks have increased." Sarah swallowed hard, but the grip of her hand showed that she was ready to keep pace with the rhythm of the heart and the fight that called them. The twilight brought a shimmering and pulsating New York, where the lights painted diffuse silhouettes on modern buildings. In a taxi winding through the city's unfamiliar streets, they left behind that small temporary refuge, aware that the truest shelter was the one they built between them. At their destination, a discreet apartment in the Upper East Side, where old friendships and established contacts could offer them protection and strategic support. There, Richard reviewed the documents they would discuss the next morning, while Sarah made sure Ethan slept peacefully, wrapped in a soft blanket, far from the tensions the adults faced. During that short night, between exchanged glances and whispers containing secrets and promises, the couple reaffirmed the urgency of joining forces to preserve not only their son's future, but also the integrity of their dreams and values. The next day, in a meeting room that smelled of polished wood and strong coffee, Richard presented a bold proposal, born not only from cold analyses, but from the strength that only true love can provide. He knew that their lives hung in the balance at that moment, but he also knew he was not alone. The negotiations were long, marked by calculating glances, heavy pauses, and dialogues punctuated by sharp subtexts. And when the decision was finally announced, it became clear that the road ahead would still have unexpected turns, but that the unbreakable union of Sarah and Richard had already made a difference. As they left, under the sunny sky that promised new beginnings, they embraced. Each shared breath was a victory won, a new beginning celebrated amid the distant sound of the metropolis that never sleeps. Back at their refuge, Ethan woke with shining eyes, asking for chocolate truffles, a small symbol of normalcy that Sarah prepared with care while Richard watched, his heart full of gratitude and hope. There, in that mix of challenges and affection, the silent promise that united them grew stronger with each step. They had learned that true wealth was not in concrete or cold numbers, but in that resilient love, capable of transforming any storm into calm. And even when the future remained uncertain, what remained was the certainty that, together, they could face any gale side by side, heart to heart. The night sky of New York sparkled with the city illuminated by countless lights, which seemed like artificial stars amid the concrete and In the small apartment in the Upper East Side, Sarah carefully closed the old book that Richard had given her weeks before, her finger gliding over the faded ink dedication, a promise etched far beyond words. Richard arrived slowly, his eyes marked by the constant struggle and the hope that persisted in his chest. He found her sitting on the sofa, her face illuminated by a warm lamp, her expression soft yet tense, as if trying to balance the weight of the world without revealing her fragility. "I was thinking," he began, sitting beside her and taking her hand in a gesture that was both a support and a caress, "that we have overcome so many battles, that we have reinvented ourselves with every step, and still, what we want most is to simply be." Sarah smiled, the lines of worry giving way to a glimmer of understanding. "To be who we are without masks," she agreed, looking out the window and seeing the city lights reflected in the glass. "And I believe that moment has arrived." There was a new calm in the air, a feeling that the turbulent days were bidding farewell to make way for something more solid, more genuine. In the months that had passed, they had managed to keep Ethan stable, balance the pressures of work, and strengthen the bond that united them against all odds. That night, driven by an almost urgent inspiration, they decided to take an important step. Sarah picked up the phone, her voice steady, and scheduled a meeting for the next day with one of the investors who had been resistant to the transformation of Richard's business, the key figure whose support could be decisive for a sustainable and ethical future. They knew it wouldn't be easy. There were no shortcuts to deep changes. As they prepared for this new phase, they also nurtured the coziness of the home where their dreams lived. Ethan slept peacefully in the light blue-painted room, the children's drawings on the walls illuminated by a soft lamp, while his parents spoke quietly about plans that went beyond spreadsheets. They were planning their lives, their desires, and the building of a strong family based on trust and sincerity. The next day dawned clear and warm, typical of spring in New York. In that meeting room, where the smell of coffee had become a constant companion, Richard presented his renewed vision. Each word carried the bitter experience transformed into learning. Each gesture showed the determination of someone fighting for something greater than themselves. The investor, a woman with a calculating gaze, known for her ability to perceive even the smallest nuances of sincerity, watched intently, her expression revealing doubts but also respect. After hours of intense dialogue, where negotiations alternated between veiled threats and bold promises, she finally spoke. "I am convinced," she said, her voice firm, "that the future of this venture needs the courage you both demonstrate. Count on me." The relief that flooded the space was palpable, almost like the air suspended by tension dissipating in a collective sigh. Richard and Sarah exchanged a glance filled with contained emotion, aware that this achievement was, in fact, the beginning of a new battle, one where honesty and love would become even more powerful weapons. On the journey back to the apartment, the slow traffic on Fifth Avenue did not diminish the silent euphoria pulsing in their hearts. Upon crossing the door, they were greeted by Ethan's radiant smile, who, with shining eyes, held a colorful drawing where the word family was painted in large, disconnected letters. Sarah embraced him tenderly, feeling that, at last, the storm was beginning to give way to the clear horizon they had always sought. Richard took her hand and, in the soft glow of the lamp, whispered, "Where we arrive now doesn't matter. What matters is that we arrived together." And in that moment, amidst the simple details that made up their lives, the chocolate truffle made with care, the silent promises, the glances that spoke more than all words. They understood that true victory was not just surviving the storms, but transforming each challenge into a step toward the happiness they had dreamed of. The city lights continued to shine outside, a silent testament to the journey that was far from over. But within that home, among laughter, tears, and shared hopes, Sarah, Richard, and Ethan had found more than shelter. They had found a reason to move forward, always together, always stronger. And so, as the clock marked the inexorable passage of time, they celebrated not an end, but the beginning of a life where love could finally bloom without fear, becoming the anchor and the sail that would guide them through all the seas yet to navigate.